Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to the CASP webinar series for 2024-2025. We are really, really pleased to see so many of you having joined us today, and we would like to start by thanking everyone who has shared this webinar with your own respective networks and for helping us CASP grow. Before we start the session that is going to be led by Professor Guy Peters today, we would just like to start by giving a brief background information about CASP, the Center for African Smart Public Value Governance. And this year, we are focusing on administrative traditions. But just before we start on the topic by Professor Guy Peters, we at CASP started in late 2020. I've just realized that we are nearly 4 years old. And we started when Imamdin and we started our own PhDs at different universities. But through Amar and at the Middlesex University Mauritius branch campus, we reconnected here. Imamdin helped us to organize a research network series, and we continued the network once we completed our respective doctoral research as well. It's an interdisciplinary organization. My colleague, Dr. Amar, and we are here at Middlesex University Mauritius. I specialize in studies of African governance and international relations. Amar specializes in the area of digital technologies, and Imamdin is in the field of public management. And combining our own disciplines and our own research areas, we thought about how can we contribute to theoretical perspectives development in the field of African governance from a public administration perspective, and bearing in mind as well transformations that are happening in society. So combining all of that together, we came up with the idea of CASP, and we launched sort of officially in September 2020. And every year so far, we have had either a webinar series or a lecture series. And our aims as an organization are twofold. We have a theoretical aim at our core, at our heart of our organization, which is to contribute to theoretical advancements in the field of public administration from an African perspective. And bearing in mind here that we are not standardizing the concept of African context, we are mindful of multiculturalism and the multiplicity of different lessons that we can learn from here in African countries, and that can help us to build on knowledge in the field of public management. Practically as well, we have a goal to be working with public practitioners, which is ongoing, and perhaps is the field that we look forward to expanding further in the future. But we look forward to working more with public practitioners and to learn from them as well, and to be able to work alongside them, perhaps for training courses, but also to use their case studies as well to bring in a theoretical perspective. So they are combined theoretical and practical aims that we've had. And yes, our webinar series as well have not been on an abstract level. For our 2021-2022 webinars, we combined, we invited different scholars from different fields, and combining their perspectives and their insight, we actually shared our perspectives about the first webinar series, which was published as an essay in the journal mentioned here, and it's about the research agenda for African smart public value governance. Sorry, it's in the Africa Journal of Management. And also, last year, we've had another lecture series as well, where we have focused on different case studies. And as mentioned by Imamdin, Dr. Salah Shafiq as well was one of our concluding speakers from last year. And we are very pleased as well for this year's session as well. He has joined us. So again, for today, Imamdin will share a little bit further with you. But the idea here is we are really, really looking forward to be connected with you. Please do subscribe to our social media channels, because we look forward to inviting you to our sessions, and also during question times to have as many questions from you as possible, and for you to challenge us. We look forward to learning from you and to building on the perspectives that you have to contribute. So on that note, Imamdin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adila. Exactly. So today we are starting with the 2024 webinar series on administrative tradition in African countries. So while we try to understand what are African ways of creating smart public value, we also thought in this year we want to engage to understand the context in which these African countries are working. We came across this concept of administrative traditions that argues that the history plays a big role. And in Africa, of course, one part of the history is the colonial legacy that is also somehow manifested in African bureaucracies. So we want to launch this webinar series to understand how these administrative traditions from these colonial histories are influencing, particularly on the three mainly democracies in Botswana, Cape Verde, Ghana, Mauritius, Senegal, and South Africa, and really get deeper into that. When you switch one slide, we can see what we are planning for this year. So today is the starting session in which we want to understand in more depth what is exactly this concept of administrative traditions, Guy Peters, and then go through these 6 countries. Mokgopodi Lekorwe is going to present on Botswana. He's also here in our webinar. I saw him, so hi, Mokgopodi. And Jess Auerbach is going to discuss and go in detail on the case in South Africa. Unfortunately, she can't be here. We're going to have then in September a presentation by Mustafa Mbenge. He is also here. Thank you very much. And by Crisanto Barros on Cape Verde. Also, Crisanto is here. So really glad to see you here also in this opening webinar. Nana Kiamfi, unfortunately not here today. She's going to talk about Ghana in November, and Mauritius will be done by the CASP founders, particularly Adila Kodabooks and Amar Seon. And then we want to have a final concluding comparing webinar in the next year, roughly in March 25. So we focusing on today's webinars, administrative traditions, understanding the roots of contemporary administrative behavior. So a person who has shaped this concept is Guy Peters, and I'm really glad that Guy can be here. He is Professor of Government in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh, founding president of the International Public Policy Association, founding editor of the International Review of Public Policy. Many awards already won. I want to highlight 2. I mean, his big contribution, he won the Fred Riggs Award for Lifetime Achievement in Public Administration. It's an annual reward by the American Society for Public Administration. Or he won the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Network of Institutes and Schools of Public Administration in Central and Eastern Europe. That shows you already how internationally connected Guy Peters is, and working on different contexts. So amongst others, he has adjunct positions in Göteborg, in Hong Kong, in Denmark, and a lot of other visiting professorships he had really across the globe. I didn't see one in Africa, but there's still time to come. And his research is also really internationally oriented, and particularly understanding and comparing different ways of how public administrations work. So there's, for example, his quite established work on the politics of bureaucracy and introduction to comparative public administration. A lot of research done on governance, how good governance looks like, what is a new form of governance, future of governance. And as already said, this concept established, refined the concept on administrative traditions. We are really looking forward to this presentation. We really want to say thank you very much for joining us in this webinar. We're really delighted, and yes, the stage is yours. Thank you very much, Guy.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. I haven't had a visiting professorship in Africa, unfortunately, but I did spend 2 months working for UNICEF in Ghana at one point, so a little bit of experience on the ground there. So let me share my screen, if I can find the right. Okay. Can you see that then? Okay, good. Well, as Emmett said, I'm going to be talking about administrative traditions. Unfortunately, I'll be talking about it primarily from a Western perspective, but I'll try to make as many connections as I can to my understanding of the African administrative traditions, and particularly toward the end, talk about the work that I'm doing with my colleague Daniel Carelli from Gothenburg in Sweden, who's with us today, on hybrid traditions. So part of the argument I'll be making today is that most administrative traditions are in fact hybrids. They're not pure in any sense. They represent overlays historically of one tradition essentially being layered on top of another or side by side with another. But I'll explain that as I get along in the talk. Okay, let's go down here. Oops, there we go. So how do we explain administrative behaviors, smart or otherwise? So y'all are focusing on smart behavior, but sometimes it isn't. Anyway, so one way of explaining it is simply its rationality. So the standard political science, economics approach of individuals are rational actors. We can also explain administrative behavior by organizational and institutional theory, going back to Max Weber or whomever you would like to go back to. We can explain it through attitudes or social theory. How do people think about their particular behavior? But the fundamental point I want to make here is that we can also explain contemporary behavior, at least in part, by what has happened in the past. And that essentially, again, we learn from our past. We're shaped by our past. The American author William Faulkner had a wonderful phrase in one of his books that the past is not dead, and it's not even past. So even though we think about this somehow as historical and gone, it's still with us and still shaping our behavior. And the past isn't singular. There are often several historical administrative systems that influence the present. So we have to think about this in a relatively complex manner. Traditions are structural. So if we sometimes to think about the evidence for the existence of an administrative tradition, you look at structures. So for example, if you're looking at a French administrative tradition or Napoleonic tradition, you might look for things like a Conseil d'Etat or some version of the Grand Corps. So things that are structural. But more importantly, I think the traditions are ideas. They're the way in which people think about what public administration should do and the way they think about how people should do it. So I really want to focus on the ideas here as much as the structures of administration. Okay, let's change here. For some reason, this is being very bulky. There we go. And traditions are a means of dealing with these ideas. The ideas that have been embedded in existing administrative systems. Sometimes they've been there for centuries, but sometimes for much shorter periods. So the legacy that Eastern European countries have, for example, of the Soviet period was roughly 50 years, 45 to 50 years. So in world historical terms, a very short period, yet at the same time having very profound impacts on the way in which those countries and their people think about the state and public administration. Some of these ideas about administration are very isolated, one nation, one set of countries. Some are much more diffused. So I will be looking at a set of variables that I have used to deal with Western administrative traditions. Now, you can assess for yourselves the extent to which these are applicable to the African administrative traditions and the way that they can be used to think about the African cases. They may or may not be useful. Some may be, some may not be. But they're a way of beginning a comparison. And I think it's important as we think about traditions, not just to say, oh, there's a tradition. That doesn't get us very far. But to think about instead what variables constitute those traditions and what is the range of variation within those traditions. So the variables then, if you have, I think, and one should have a number put together in different ways, then will constitute the traditions. And interesting, as I did this book that Amy had the nice picture of on his slide, some of the ideas that are in the book from the Western cases seem to work in other parts of the global South reasonably well, particularly Latin America. So the Latin American cases, these same basic ideas showed up and were relatively useful in understanding what goes on. So let me go through now a set of these variables. I'll try to do this reasonably quickly so that we'll have enough time to look at the hybrid cases. I think to some extent that's more important for what this project that you're working on is about. So the first of the variables is the relationship between state and society. And here a very simple dichotomy between organic and contractual versions of the state. So where does the state come from? So one version, sort of a Hegelian version, is that the state is essentially an organic entity that's co-created along with society, that it is inherently a part of society. Very more representative, I think, in continental Europe. The Anglo-American version is the state is a contract between the people and the state. So the American Declaration of Independence is a very clear example of that sort of thinking. And therefore, the state is not permanent, it's not organic, it's not a metaphysical concept, it's merely a human creation, and therefore is changeable. And this was the argument that the founders in the US made, and John Locke as a political philosopher made. And there's some analogs, excuse me, of these understandings of the state in non-Western cases. And the other part of this, which is important also, though, is the nature of society itself. How strong is the society? If we think about the work from some political sociologists about the strong states and weak states and strong societies, then the importance becomes of how is society itself structured? How voluntaristic is it? Do people join groups? Bob Putnam's work. So is there this civil society base for governance or not? Secondly, law versus management. So how does the civil servant think of his or her job when they go into work in the morning? Well, if my experience with German civil servants, for example, and Swiss, I think to some extent, is that they think of themselves as lawyers. So their job is to understand the law, know the law, and apply it in a strictly legal manner. Now, American civil servants are not thinking illegally, but the first thing they think about in the morning, I think, is how do we make this thing work? They're managers. So their job is to manage a program, make it work within the law, but the law isn't the first thing they think about. They think about the managerial aspects. And again, if we're talking about, I think in your case of smart public management, then you have to think, again, how do civil servants conceptualize the job? Again, always operating within the law, but at the same time, thinking about managerial aspects. And some of this showed up in the differential adoption of new public management. So new public management was certainly a major a set of ideas that swept the world, but swept the world in different ways and to different degrees. So they were much less successful in the US than they were in other parts of the world. In part because we had old public management ahead of it. And same way with my Canadian friends to the north. So this law versus management notion also is variable within traditions. Thirdly is state and society, number 2. So the first state and society variable was essentially the organic versus contractual nature. The second has to do with how does the state and public administration connect with social actors, interest groups, civil society actors, and so forth. So again, in Western cases, there's again a relatively stark dichotomy, too stark a dichotomy between pluralist and corporatist traditions. The extent to which social actors, interest groups, segments of society are co-opted and work with the state directly, or are kept on the outside and have to essentially fight for access. So again, if we think of it in European cases, Northern Europe, Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland to some extent, have a corporatist tradition of involvement of social actors and have done so for centuries in some cases. Whereas the Anglo-American and to some extent French Napoleonic cases are much more pluralist. Groups are on the outside and often conceptualized as illegitimate. So again, if you're trying to build a smart public administration, I think in 2024, you have to think about how you link with these actors that are developing in society, unions, civil society organizations of all sorts, to make them effective within the state, as well as making the state effective with them. And also, this is a two-way flow, that to some extent, state actors leave the state and go to work in the private sector. The phenomenon of pantouflage in France, I think, is a good example here, where many senior civil servants leave at a relatively early age to go work in public corporations, make a lot more money, but also then influence the private sector to some extent on behalf of the state. So make this very close linkage between the private sector and the public sector. Okay, a fourth dimension here is politics and administration. So what is the role of bureaucrats vis-a-vis their political leaders? So what is their job? Working with, when they work with their political leaders. So all Western cases start with some sort of Weberian or Wilsonian background. I think that essentially the political leaders have legitimacy, whether it's from traditional foundation or more commonly now, of course, from a democratic foundation. And the job then of the civil servant is to do what he or she is told and to follow orders. But that really is very different in practice. And certainly in most cases now, there are very high levels of increasing politicization, where both the civil servants are being directed more by their political leaders, and some of that autonomy of civil servants is being undermined. And also the civil servants themselves are seeing that to be influential, to have their policy ideas adopted, they have to make them more politically palatable. They have to understand politics. They can't just merely be thinking and giving quote unquote frank and fearless advice. If that frank and fearless advice is unrelated to what politicians want. So the two sides then of this dichotomy have to work together. And the linkage between politics and administration was very strong in the old developmental administration literature. So when I was in grad school back in the dark ages, then there was a very major literature on development administration. And this was in the 1960s when these issues were extremely important. And one of the points that was always made was that the civil service, the administrators, had to be political. They had to be committed to developmental goals, or they were really of no use to the developmental projects. So this I think question continues, and certainly with contemporary populist politics, some of the same logic is being heard. That is, if you're not committed to the program, leave. We don't want you. So I think there's an important question still. This question, I think, is getting more interesting, in fact, rather than less interesting. Okay. Fifthly in my list is uniformity. How uniform does government have to be across its territory? Do you have to do the same thing in every place at the same time? Now, a federal structure, for example, Nigeria in Africa, federalism basically assumes that you don't have to. That part of the reason for federalism is to allow the states or provinces, or whatever they're called, to make some of their own decisions and not to enforce a strict uniformity of action across the system. And this also links very directly to hybrids that we'll be talking about later. So in some cases, for example, Louisiana in the United States, part of a federal system, but it uses Napoleonic law for civil law as civil law rather than common law. So all 49 states use common law. Louisiana, because of its heritage, its traditions, uses civil law. So nobody seems to worry about this too much. But there is underlying this a question about equality. So how do you need to be able to produce a quality of outcomes to the extent possible? Can you do that without an attempt to create some uniformity? But also, I think a really important question that's arisen in this, I think, in terms of uniformity, has been the recognition of special status for indigenous populations. So first Canadians, Native Americans in the United States, the Maori in New Zealand, increasingly are being given rights to run their own lives, and to then create a lack of uniformity within otherwise uniform states. So we need to think then about how do we deal with social difference, religious difference, other forms of differences that may exist within a territory, and how does that relate to administration? And then finally, it's a question of service orientation. How committed are public servants to public service? We hope, of course, that they're very committed to public service. That's what we want them to be there, but there are marked differences. So if you look at the comparative literature on public service motivation, PSM here, there are marked differences even within Western traditions but also between Western and non-Western cases, in the extent to which civil servants think of themselves then as service deliverers, or do they think of themselves more as regulators? Do they think of themselves as imposing rules on people rather than providing services to people? And I think this is, I think, very important. And it's linked also then to increasing interest in participative and collaborative governance. So to what extent do you deal with your public, with your population in a formalistic, legalistic manner, or do you do it through negotiation, bargaining, reasoning together to try to produce the best outcomes for people? And again, huge differences in the way in which people think, so the way in which public servants think about their roles in these terms. So for those of you who haven't read the book, I hope you will at some point, but for those of you who haven't, I put all these set of variables together and a couple more that weren't particularly relevant, I thought, for this morning, and argued that there were four basic traditions in Western governments, in Western public administration. The first was Napoleonic, and I labeled it as Napoleonic, but it may go much deeper. So Francois Dreyfus, a distinguished French scholar of public administration, always gets upset with me for calling it Napoleonic, because her argument is that it goes back much further into the Ancien regime. It goes back to Louis XIV or whomever, much more, as well as being Napoleonic. So that's another argument. Second is Germanic. So that the administrative tradition characterized by Germany, Austria, to some extent Switzerland, to some extent the Netherlands. Scandinavian, fairly self-explanatory, and then Anglo-American. And the Anglo-American case is the most different, is the most diverse internally. So we all have a common root, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, Australia, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, we're also very diverse. Most of us are federal, but some are unitary. So a number of these variables that one uses to characterize public administration and government in general are different within the Anglo-American cases. Okay, now, having laid out those ideas about administrative traditions, the fundamental proposition I would make to you this morning is that few, if any, administrative systems are pure, are not hybrid. So hybridity among administrative systems is important for understanding. And again, this is the work that I'm doing with Daniel Corelli, and trying to understand hybridity and how it works. So in a hybrid system, I've said that ideas are important, but there are multiple ideas at work. And we have to understand then, how do they work with each other, or do they? One may or may not be dominant. And we need to find ways of understanding their interactions. So some of this then I think will require identifying, again, sets of variables, but also probably doing much more detailed casework. So I'm very pleased to see that you have these 6 cases coming up for the rest of the year. So I look forward to seeing those and seeing how then the various traditions that exist within those 6 cases work out among themselves. So let me talk quick then about types of hybridity. So I've said that all cases are hybrid to some extent. But arguably, there are at least 3 versions of hybridity at work. One is vertical, that is that the traditions are layered historically one on top of another. So a really good example, for example, it would be Bosnia in the Western Balkans, which at various times has been ruled by the Ottomans, by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, by the communist country of Yugoslavia. Excuse me. Now it's got its own. I'm probably leaving out some too. Daniel, you can fill me in later. But leaving out some. So there are all these layers, and one on top of another. And it's obviously true, as Adela said at the beginning, of colonized countries. So they have the traditions imposed by the colonial country on top of pre-existing traditions. And now after independence, the attempt then to create a new operative tradition for the new states. Okay, so the vertical layering is important. Secondly, the horizontal layering is important. The persistence of different traditions. I gave the example before of Louisiana. Quebec in Canada, it also uses French law. And thirdly, which I haven't talked about yet, is the layering of theory and administrative ideologies. So, for example, new public management. So they're really dealing with complexity here. So I've got a separate slide on each. So layering it. So there's some of the literature on historical institutionalism, and particularly change in historical institutionalism, talks about layering as a fundamental mechanism for producing change. But his history, to some extent, does that for you. History has layered things in. And almost all countries have had some experience of this since 1800 at least. So the data set that Daniel's been working on begins with 1800, trying to look at the various layerings that have occurred in all the countries of the world. Extremely ambitious, but should be interesting. And it's especially relevant for Africa and other colonized regions. So how does this work? How does a layering system work? How do you use things from the past to work into the present? How do you dismiss the past? Because as Faulkner said, the past isn't past. It's always there. No matter how much we might at times want to get rid of it. Okay, let's switch here. Come on. There we go. Okay, secondly, the horizontal cases. Less common, but still relevant. So my neighbor to the north in Canada are doing this now with, again, with Quebec. So Quebec uses French law for civil law and for some criminal law. And also has a separate set of legal foundations and legal and administrative operations for the indigenous communities, including one huge province, Nunavut in the north, that's essentially is an indigenous managed and formulated territory of Canada. It used to be part of the Northwest Territories, and now simply has become a huge indigenous territory. Also, we can see this in terms of actually the administration of law. So Scotland, as a part of the United Kingdom, isn't so united. That the Scottish legal tradition is reasonably close to the French. So offices like the Procurator Fiscal, that office is very similar to examining magistrates in French law. So these things exist side by side, continue to work. Again, questions of equality exist, but also then questions about in terms of working and thinking about smart management is how do you make them work? How do you create equality, and how do you create effective governance with that? And then the third type of hybridity I was going to talk about is ideological and theoretical. And I think every administrative system has some of this, because they're always fads and fashions in thinking about what is good government, what is good administration. So historically, we've been through any number of these. So I made a little list. I was thinking about the United States in my own case here. So we went through, and this is probably a short list, classical public administration, good old-fashioned Wilson, Weber, market ideas about governing from the Hoover and Ash commissions, rationality, strong emphasis on rationality during the late 1950s, early 1960s, new public management, participatory governance with the Gore Commission and the National Performance Review, and then finally new public governance, a more collaborative form of thinking. So what do we got? 6 versions here that essentially all layered in. And still, some of them are still at work. For example, PPBS, program budgeting, was a product of the 1950s, 1960s, and the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. It was brought into government from the private sector by Robert McNamara. So PBS was a crashing failure in government, except it was good for planning. So several cabinet departments in the U.S. still 50 years later, 60 years later, use PPBS for planning. So it's very clearly identifiable as one layer that's still existing from quite a while ago. So the questions. What are the dynamics? I think one of the important things to think about theoretically is how do these things work together, or do they? Secondly, are some pairings better than others? So does the Napoleonic tradition work better with some other traditions than not? With various versions of more traditional forms of administration. So, mix and match. How do they work together? Do deep legacies matter? So how far back does it matter? So Latin America, for example, the end of the colonial rule from Spain was mostly for the Bolivarian revolutions in the 1820s, and the same way in a similar revolution in Brazil in the 1830s. So that's been now 200 years ago. So how does it still work? Does it still matter? Same way to somewhat more recent with the Ottomans in the Balkans. Do legacies affect different aspects of government differently? How do they affect economic performance and economic policy? Do they affect public services, political administrative relations? So in the argument, I think, or the question should be, or the assumption should be that these old embedded traditions don't affect everything equally. We have to sort out where they affect things and how. And then finally, does it really matter? Daniel and I hope very much that it does, because we're investing a lot of time and energy in this right now in thinking about hybridity. But does the hybridity really matter? So I think that's the as we would say, the $64,000 question. So in conclusion, I think I'm about at the end of my half hour that I was given. Ideas do matter, and history does matter. Again, the quote from Faulkner. And the huge variety of different ideas at work as we think about public administration, both in terms of historically and in 2024. And they interact in a number of different ways. And we've got a major research question here to work with. So it should be fun for the rest of this year and for years to come. So thanks very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank Hughie. And so on that note, we have a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure there are questions that must be coming up. Anyone would like to lead with a question? Feel free to raise your hand, and we'll go according to who comes up first. Otherwise, may I start with a question? And my question is, we focus much on understanding these administrations, obviously, how they are shaped by historical context and so on. What about when we bring the same logic here onto the global field? We understand it's increasingly globalized world and increasingly global networks, and public bureaucracies, they do interact with one another. And they come from different settings and from different backgrounds. So when they interact, when public bureaucracies from different countries interact with one another, is there a particular tradition that stands out in the way that they interact with one another? Is we talk about one dominating or another? Is there a way of understanding and studying such interactions?
Interesting question. Well, I mean, I think this is part of the idea that the third version of the hybridity that I was talking about, which is the sharing of ideas about contemporary administration. So sometimes called ideas and good currency. So what are the current fads and fashions in administration? And so, and clearly, some of this has to do, I think, with the power of donor organizations or international organizations. So for the OECD, the UN, the World Bank, etc., when they get an idea about what good administration is, people these tend to get diffused rather quickly. And because particularly for donor-donee relationships, they tend to be very powerful and tend to be adopted, even if they're inappropriate, which I think in many cases they are. So I think there is some natural sharing, some natural diffusion of innovation, policy learning. So again, the literature on policy learning, for example, would be very important there. But there's also, to some extent, still some imposition of ideas from powerful actors, again, particularly the donor community.
Thank you. And before I start monopolizing the question time, anyone else would like to follow up or ask question? Yes, someone's hand is raised. Sorry, Marlene. Marlene, please go ahead here.
Yeah, thank you very much for organizing the seminar, and thank you, Guy Peters, for this great presentation. I've also read your book, so I'm really looking forward to see some of the work that you announced that you're working on. It sounds really exciting. And my question is about this question of hybridity. I thought it was really useful that you presented different ways of thinking about hybridity. And then at the very beginning, you also mentioned that we can think of traditions as structures and ideas, right? And that's something that is in this literature. It has been there for forever. And how do you grapple with that in terms of hybridity? Can we think of, that, for example, ideas change quicker than structures, or is it the other way around, or is there no particular order? Because that's something that I've been thinking a lot about. And any thoughts? Welcome.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting research question. I would argue personally that structures change more readily than do ideas, because all you have to do is to change a structure to pass a law. It doesn't mean that people are then going to behave any differently once you pass the law. So I think, and sometimes I think a lot of administrative reform, hybrid or not, is in fact simply moving boxes. And I have to tell the background of that phrase. I worked for a couple of years on and off as a consultant for the Prime Minister and the Ministry of Finance in Finland on administrative reform. And the first meeting the team of us had with the Prime Minister, he said, okay, first thing, don't just move boxes. He said most administrative reform is just manipulating the structures, changing this, moving this box over here, moving that box over there. That's not what he wanted. He wanted changes of ideas. He wanted some fundamental reform. So changing boxes is easy, but it often is not very productive. So I think you really do have to think about changing ideas. But it's harder. So again, if you're thinking theoretically, this is in the in institutionalism. If you think about people like the March and Olson arguments about logics of appropriateness. So what we're really trying to do, I think, when we change ideas, is to change logics of appropriateness. What's appropriate behavior for administrators? Does that answer it?
Thank you. You've provided a lot of food for thought. But yes, Marlene, I think that yeah, okay, thumbs up.
Okay.
Marlene, yeah. Questions from our participants? In case I miss anyone's hand being raised, please. Yes, Klaus.
Thank you, guys, for organizing, and thank you, Guy, for being part of this terrific webinar series and for launching us off so effectively. In terms of studying hybridity, I'm an organizational scholar, and in the field of organizational studies, the concept of hybridity has also gained traction over the last 10 years or so, primarily but not exclusively in the context of social ventures. So the hybridity there is between a market logic and a welfare logic. And I guess the sort of research practitioner in me seeks to understand how to study hybridity best. So basically the question, how do you recognize hybridity when it hits you in the face, is a practical and a methodological question. And it assumes that there are distinct logics or traditions, to use your terminology. So do we study then observable behavior, observable practices, or do we study discourse? So any reflections on sort of the how to study hybridity at a very practical level, if I may?
Very good question. I like staying with the theory, is much easier. Anyway, but one way is to go back. If we go back to Marlene's question, one place to start is to look at the structures. So, are there a set of structures in place that look essentially funny, look hybrid? So then you begin to see, how. So that leads to a set of questions about behavior, I think. So clearly, I think to do this well, one has to get into interviewing people about, again, the logics of their behavior, or how do they, where do these ideas come from? So I think this is really then trying to do case studies of, and the 6 case studies of countries that are coming up, maybe at a too macro a level. So you may well have to go down to individual agencies and organizations to make this work. So one interesting research idea might be to take a similar department or agency in 6 countries and then look at them in more detail. And particularly one which has, I think, the 2 types of hybridity, that the one that I'm talking about and the one that you're mentioning, from the organizational literature. And I guess too, also from what you were saying from the institutional logics literature in sociology.
Swad, if you have a question, feel free to unmute. Otherwise, in the meantime, Imamdin, your hand is raised. Go ahead. Yeah. Unmute, please.
I saw it. Yeah, it connects a bit to the previous question. So you mentioned this research project you're doing with Daniel, and so as I understand, or maybe can you talk a bit, maybe also Daniel, you a bit about this project? So as I understand, you're working with secondary data. Can you provide maybe some insight in exactly how you capture their hybridity?
I'll turn it over to Daniel, so, because he's actually been working more on the data so far than I have.
Okay. Well, we haven't really started the project. We have only begun, the thinking and theorizing. I have done some initial mapping. I think hybridity is a buzzword. It's used everywhere. So if you study archaeology or medicine, or even making recipes for food, you always come down to that you can blend ideas and institutions or whatnot. And the hybridity, the outcome that we call hybridity, is perhaps not the most useful outcome. It's an idea or a notion that allows us to think really in different dimensions. So as Guy pointed out, we can think in terms of the vertical layering effects, the horizontal, and call it whatever you want, diagonal or ideational or ideological. And so what we began, I think hybridity as a research strategy or analytical strategy is more useful to map or to try to extract nuance in entities that we take for granted today. So its states have more nuance than we commonly ascribe to them. So if we think of Malta or Cyprus or several African countries with colonial heritage, we need to account for the variation in those legacies. And so we began by looking at all the different countries in the world, so around 200, and just from information from Britannica, the encyclopedia, when there have been regime changes, were they warranted or were they imposed by the external regime, and sort of trying to map which traditions seem to coexist and when are they changed and what point in time did they change. So it's probably another idea of public administration that can emerge in the early 19th century than in the 1950s. So we need to start doing a lot of mapping before we can ask people about how much hybridity affect them in their everyday lives. And by that time, when we do those interviews or survey, we might not even use the word hybridity, because I think hybridity can mess it up too much, but it's useful as an analytical strategy right now, I think. Guy, what do you say?
Good answer, thank you. But I think the important thing is that we are beginning with a relatively simple mapping of things, and then trying to go deeper over time. But even the initial mapping involves a reasonable investment of time and energy, particularly from Daniel. I copped out on a lot of it.
I wouldn't be able to do it without your book, Guy. So
okay.
You already invest a lot of time and effort in this.
Okay.
So.
Anyway,
I'm Opudi here.
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Just a follow up on the concept of hybridity. I was wondering whether, in the same breath, you can be referring to it as say parallel systems working side by side, and at one point one being dominant and at another point one not being dominant. Could that be sort of the concept you are thinking?
Yeah, well, certainly that's one option. So you working side by side, you're saying, again, it applies to me more of a horizontal system. But also, I think to some extent, these are hidden. So I think if you have two, clearly developed traditions that are working simultaneously in the same organization or the same administrative system, that's, I think, very different than having a system in which you have what seems to be a unified way of doing things, but in reality, it reflects a number of different ideas. And one may be one set of ideas may or may not be dominant. I mean, usually one set of ideas is, but they may not be. They may all be mixed up together, and so that's important because I think it creates the potential for inconsistency, creates the potential for essentially misunderstandings and poor and not so smart administration. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Good.
Thank you. Feel free to keep questions coming, and in case I've missed anyone's virtual hand being raised, apologies for that. Otherwise, we do. Go ahead.
Sala had a question on
yes.
chat. So
may I please read it because the session is being recorded? Guy, apologies for interrupting you. But the question is, for record purposes, you spoke about trends and fads within traditions, particularly the United States, or one with 6 ideas or approaches. Do you think that some administrative traditions, for example, indigenous ones, tend not to have a rotating door of ideas or approaches, but rather exhibit consistency? And what would that mean for hybridity? Thank you for question.
Okay, I think some traditions may well be sort of essentially locked in time and place, and not want to change. But to some extent, even if they have been replaced or supplanted by others, they still may be adapting. So I think some traditions, whether they're ideological or based upon historical or national ideas, some will be more consistent than will others. And I think, that's another research question. We simply don't know yet, I don't think, not having researched this thoroughly. But it would be interesting to know as we work on this and as you work on this, just what's the long-term viability of different ideas and different traditions? Why do some things hang around for centuries and others are simply birds of passage and vanish very quickly?
Thank you. Anyone else with questions? Yes. Thank you, Guy. Anyone else wanted to unmute and I've missed them? Apologies for that. No. Well.
Oh, Klaus is back.
Klaus, yeah.
Sorry, I just a follow-up. It's actually not a question. It's more a sort of a thought that I want to offer to the conversation. Well, first of all, there is a conversation, I think, not only in organizational studies, but also in political science and adjacent field on the travel of ideas. So if we want to study hybridity and if ideas are critical to understanding hybridity, then maybe that literature, how ideas travel, I'm paraphrasing. There's even an article, I think, on that with that name. So that is one concept that might be interesting. So the travel metaphor in the context of ideas. And then the second conversation that comes to mind is the notion of translation. So how are certain ideas, that are, very abstract, decontextual, how are they translated and contextualized and enacted in a specific setting? New public management, just for the argument's sake, would be something like that. How has new public management been translated into the various empirical contexts? So these are just two ideas, food for thoughts on that.
Yeah, Well, they're both very useful, Klaus. On the traveling idea, I mean, I think we can even go back to the diffusion of innovations literature by you, and how do innovations travel? But there's a huge literature in political science and particularly policy studies on policy learning. And so some of this, again, you almost have two versions of the policy learning. Some is when people seek to be active learners and they go out and look for new ideas because they have a problem. And the other is when essentially the ideas in good currency are almost thrust upon them. So we can think about this, the learning and the traveling. And then the third part of the literature too, which I think it's interesting, and Richard Rose talked about, is in terms of lesson drawing, which is sort of, I think, your idea about, to some extent, about translation. So that you see something working in country X that seems great. And so, okay, we want it. But then you have to translate it into your setting. And so that whole process of lesson drawing from successes elsewhere or failures elsewhere I think it's important. So I think it was one of my favorite examples I always use when I'm teaching is the San Francisco, the Bay Area Rapid Transit in San Francisco, because the people who designed it, said, Munich has a wonderful rapid transit system, public transport system. So they could hop on the plane and flew to Munich. I said, oh, great, this is great. We'll have one. And went back and tried to recreate Munich in San Francisco. Failing to notice, for example, that there was this huge body of water in the middle between Oakland and San Francisco that didn't exactly exist in Munich, et cetera, et cetera. Never mind the social and other aspects. So that translation and lesson drawing part of it, I think, is crucial.
Thank you for that very interesting example. And anyone has any further question? Imamdin, Omar?
Yeah,
I
maybe.
was going...
Oh, please,
Sorry.
Omar.
No, thanks. No, I was just
go ahead, please.
Thinking about that point about translation to another country. I think we're seeing with put my geek hat on here, the disruption we're seeing with artificial intelligence and how that's rapidly disrupting the world and data colonialization as well. So we're having all these issues with, and it's happening rapidly. We're starting to see rapid deployments in countries that lack data, and we're taking data from other countries, predominantly, let's say, America, and then superimposing all these AI systems and algorithms that have been developed with data sets that are not, especially in Africa. So we're going to start to see some of these other kind of colonial issues emerge for artificial intelligence.
Yeah, interesting. So, a new colonialism, or another new colonialism.
Yes, Imamdin, if you wish to ask your question. Lulia, let's have Lulia first. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for organizing the series, and thank you, Guy Peters, for the presentation. We've also been assigned your book in our class, in an MPA class, so we've been thinking about the concept of traditions for some time now. I was curious to hearing more about the African component of the hybrid models in Africa, since a lot of post-colonial public administration literature talks about the imposition of Western models and the fact that that leads to incongruity between bureaucracy and society. So I was really wondering, in African context, what are examples of institutions where that alignment between society and bureaucracy still exists, or if there are any examples?
Or the alignment or misalignment?
Well, both, but specifically the alignment in terms of what is particularly African about African traditions, and how might we start to even, think about these traditions when maybe the variables that you identified for the Western models don't apply in these contexts?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I can answer it, but I think what I've seen about that I think is most applicable in terms of in the literature is that the disjunction essentially then that many cases have the argument is that there are two systems existing side by side. One that exists in the national capital, which is to some extent a legacy of the colonial past, and as essentially then as it's been translated, and the other that exists once one moves away from the national capital, and that these are very different. And even again, when I was working for UNICEF in Ghana, I saw a bit of that, because I mean all the ministries in Accra looked to just the language, the whole structure was Britain in the 1950s. Very, very similar sort of discourse even, I think. Then when it goes out to talk to people in the field, the discourse was very different. So again, I think some essentially bureaucratic anthropologists have done some interesting work on this. I don't know if you know Olivier de Sardin, French guy. He wrote it. He and a German anthropologist, Thomas Bierschick, wrote a really huge book on the state at work. It's on Africa and African administration, and about the disjuncture between the formal models and the informal models. It's really interesting. And then the two other citations. One is a Danish anthropologist, Christian Lund, on what he wrote, the Twilight State, something on the Twilight State. And then finally, a book that was just out by Noah Nathan, called the Scarce State. So he was arguing that the state is very visible in the national capital, but when you move out, the state becomes very scarce. And the traditional forms of administration and governance then are dominant once you move out.
Thank you very much for the question. Sorry, Guy. Please continue.
Go ahead. That's okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say thank you, Klaus, as well, for the suggestions for the readings in the field. And Imam Din Omar and I, we also have an upcoming chapter about a case study from Mauritius regarding the light rail transit system. That chapter will be published by the end of this year, and it's in a book for positive public administration. And in our case study, essentially, we look at how this particular case study of a light rail transit system has been very mindful of local context in terms of stakeholders from the public sector and the way that they delivered this public project. And the project was met initially with a lot of criticisms, but we no longer hear about the criticisms at the moment after the implementation phase, because they have been very mindful of the traditions here that locally, and they have embedded that in their strategy and in their way of overcoming some of the challenges they encountered. So I believe that it's also a growing an emerging field in terms of case studies that can come up from African country context in the plural sense, and it's not going to be uniform. We are going to have very distinct cases that we can learn from. In fact, as well, in the work of Dr. Salah Shafik as well, the Moroccan case, there are what we are observing from this network that we are developing with researchers around the world. Yes, indeed, there is mainly a traditional focus from Western context and so on, but there are growing examples as well from other regions in the world that we hope to contribute to, and namely here from African context. So yeah, no spoiler alert, further spoiler alert from here. Our chapter will be published and we'll be sharing it with our network. So please stay tuned and follow up on our social media pages. And if there are no further questions, of course, if there are questions, feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, go ahead, Imam Din, yes.
Just also in addition to the question raised by Lulia, and of course the idea to go deeper into African examples is what we want to do in the upcoming webinars also.
Yeah, you're here.
Yeah, I'll definitely stick around for that.
Thank you, Lulia. And on that note, I believe, Amar, the concluding part of today's session, the microphone is yours. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks again to Professor Peters for setting the scene for this webinar series. So now we're going to go for a tour around Africa, starting with Botswana and South Africa. So this is scheduled for the 19th of June with the same kind of time. And we're privileged to host two distinguished scholars who are going to go into the respective countries. Firstly, we have, and he's here today, Professor Mogapodi Lukurwe from University of Botswana. We're also one of CAF's kind of partners. Professor Lukurwe is he's a professor of public administration, and he's not new to our webinar series. As has been said, he's joined us previously for our third webinar, which was way back in 2021, how time passes, and he gave us some insights into smart governance. So his expertise in public administration and governance well recognized. He's been instrumental in launching several professional development programs, primarily for public administration within SADC. He's also has a crucial role as a national investigator for the Afrobarometer for Botswana. That's quite a massive research project in itself. Remind everyone, his previous presentation was on the digital divide and implications for smart government in Africa, and that was met with great enthusiasm. We were hoping to see some more of that, discussing Botswana as a case study. And joining us for the first time in the series, we do have all the links, and I'm going to share the URL with you in a moment, so you can see all the previous webinars that we've had. It's just popped up in the chat there, so it's one of the questions. But joining us for the first time, let me set up for Professor Jess Orbach. She's an NRF rated anthropologist and associate professor at the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town. She's bringing us fresh perspectives, research spanning digital connectivity, sensory experience, communication, education, futures. Our focus is going to be on South Africa. Bit of a pitch for her. She's offered 2 books, currently working on a third that focuses on the politics of knowledge infrastructure in the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean. So looking forward to our debut presentation for our CASP network. And we're looking forward to seeing a lot of you join us and more of you join us on the 19th of June. So please mark that in your diaries, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. So I think I missed that point of all our links for all our previous webinars. I think I was going into the future there. So we do of course need to have these sessions are going to be recorded, and they're available, and you can see that on the page here at www.casp.org. So all our webinars going back from the very first one are archived there, so you can follow us and see how CASP has grown since then. Please also follow us on LinkedIn. That's how we will post a lot of information about our webinars, about the articles that we post, and other kind of activities that we're involved in. We're also on X, and we're looking to get on the Times and set ourselves up with an Instagram page. So these are where you're going to if you're interested in more information for CASP, this is where you guys should be going. And of course, you'll see all our webinars and events, and you'll see more information on our website. And we have also an email address. If you want to drop an email, that will come to all of us, and we can also get back to you. So thank you once more. Thank you, Professor Peters, for giving us such a great, wonderful insight into administrative traditions. You've really helped set the scene for this series, which is we're going to go around for several countries, our tour in Africa, and go in and deep dive in each one. So we're looking forward to seeing all of you join us for these and continuing the discussions. And of course, let's keep these discussions going, and you can also follow us on the social media as well. So that brings us towards the end of today's session. If there's any further points, maybe we can take them. Otherwise, we'll close, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the future.
No further point, Amar, but just something I forgot to do at the beginning. Yes, Amar, Imamdin, and I, we are the co-founders at CASP, and we have support as well from two very important members. There is Ronia, and there is Metkel as well. They are students at the University of Bern, and they have been involved behind the scenes as well. So we are very much grateful for their involvement in CASP, and we look forward to working with a growing number of support assistants and with our networks as partners as well. So thank you very much for attending today.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Guy, again, also for a really interesting presentation.
My pleasure.
We keep in touch. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all.